Hello and welcome to part 2 of our little tour around Spain. After Rioja last week, we're now moving southwest, heading towards Portugal to the Castilla y León region, and we're moving up and down the Duero River here. The Duero is the river that widens and becomes the Douro in Portugal, which we'll look at when we come to Portugal. And the three areas we're looking at here are Rueda, Toro and Ribera del Duero, areas whose names you might be familiar with, but I'm hoping to give you a bit more in-depth information today. So we're starting in the middle region with Rueda, which is best known for its whites, mainly from the Verdejo grape. You're also permitted to use Sauvignon Blanc here and a little bit of Viura, but the Verdejo grape was brought here in the Middle Ages from North Africa by monks who were obviously, as we've seen before, heavily involved in winemaking throughout Europe in the Middle Ages. And in this area of Rueda, it's quite high elevation, between 750 to 800 metres high, and this means that you get really hot summers and really in the wines. There's also very little rainfall in this area, as there is across Spain. It's quite a low rainfall country, and one of the benefits of this is that, along with the breezes that you get in this region and the high altitude, it means that there's very few pests and diseases in the vineyard, which means that in Rueda and a lot of these regions it's actually much easier to practice organic viticulture, and that's more commonly seen in this area. After phylloxera devastated the vineyards in Rueda and throughout Spain, this is one of the areas that was never really revitalised right up until the 70s, and Marqués de Riscal moved in and started to replant the vineyards, revitalise it to make white wine, because they wanted something that they couldn't really produce in the Rioja region, or weren't at the time, which is a much fresher, lighter wine. And they planted a lot of Sauvignon as well, which is why you see quite a bit of Sauvignon in this area. Riscal, don't forget, were also connected with Bordeaux back in the day, so a lot of those French imports started to spread across Spain as well. As a result of this planting in the 70s, and some plantings that were already there, the average age of the vines here is about 40 years old or even older. This is quite important in an area with low rainfall, or even in an area where you sometimes get deluges of rain. Old vines are much more stable in marginal climates. With young vines, if you get a sudden deluge, the vines suck up a lot of water very quickly and can burst the grapes, or you end up with very dilute grapes. Or if it's a very dry area that don't have the roots down deep enough into this limestone soil to draw up enough water on a regular basis to keep the grapes growing steadily. With old vines, the vascular system in the vine, particularly when they're quite gnarled, means that it draws up water quite slowly but steadily, so that when you've got very little water, its extensive root system pulls all of that water to the surface slowly. But if you do get a deluge, because it's much more slowly drawing the water up, you don't get that sudden influx of water which can damage the grapes and the quality of the wine. Most of the wines of Rueda are meant to be drunk young and fresh. That's the style of it. That's what it always has been, particularly when Riscal started making wine here. They wanted that freshness. We're starting to see a few examples now that are either more concentrated and age-worthy or even oaked, but the style predominantly, like this example here, is all about the freshness. This is the Canalla Rueda Verdejo, which means it's got to be at least 85% Verdejo, and this has 15% Sauvignon Blanc in it. And if we give that a taste now. The clones of Verdejo they use here as well, incidentally, are the original ones from the area rather than brought in from elsewhere. Clones are quite important, as we'll see in Toro and Ribera del Duero as well. The local clones have really developed hand in hand with the weather and the climate, and they found the best ones to suit the area. There's quite a lot of concentration on the nose. It's got lovely citrus fruit, also a little bit of tropical fruit coming through. Don't forget this is a lovely warm climate. There's freshness there, but there's a little hint of sort of pineapple, passion fruit as well. I also find with Verdejo on its own, it's a lovely honeyed wine, but I think the Sauvignon here just gives it a little lift, and I think Sauvignon on its own I find quite an uninteresting wine unless it's been handled really carefully. I think this is, for the price, this has got much more complexity than a similarly priced Sauvignon varietal on its own, but it does benefit from having that little bit blended back in. I think it makes it a more complex wine. This would work really well with anything you could have with Sauvignon, like seafood. It's a really versatile wine, but I think it also could go with any amount of different tapas, either vegetable, meat, or fish, or even pan-Asian dishes, anything from Thailand, China, Korea. I think it's got the acidity and the body to stand up to some quite complex flavours. There's a little bit of red grown in the region, mainly Tempranillo, a little bit of Cabernet Sauvignon permitted, again, another of those imported grapes. It's not allowed to be called Red Rueda. It's labelled, perhaps a little confusingly, Viña del Tierra, Castilla y León, which is probably why you don't see it on many wine lists. And not just that, there's so many great reds grown just on either side of Rueda that I think are much, much better, as we'll see next. Heading west from Rueda, we come to Toro, and the predominant wine here is red, and it's the local clone of Tempranillo, the Tinta de Toro. The region here is slightly lower than Rueda, but it's still quite high, so again, you're getting that diurnal variation. You get that lovely hot days, cool nights, so you get the lovely ripeness to the fruit. Can tend to a little bit too high on the alcohol. The wines used to be described as quite rustic, but modern winemaking techniques that have been brought into the region have tamed that a little bit, but they're still noticeably higher in alcohol than wines from Ribera del Duero or Rioja. Up until the turn of this century, the wines of Toro were really not known at all. A lot of the vineyards that were sort of redeveloped from sort of mid-90s, 2000 onwards, were done so by Ribera del Duero producers like Vega Sicilia, Pesquera, who moved into the area to sort of exploit the established vineyards and the great vineyard land that is in the area, and sort of bring their knowledge and techniques into the area to revitalise it. As well as the driving winemakers, as they're called in Spain, there's a lot of these winemakers moving to different regions and exploring the established vineyards that have perhaps languished and been unloved over the decades. There's also the so-called flying winemakers, such as Michel Rolland and the Lurtons of Bordeaux. So again, we're seeing that Bordeaux connection is still very much alive throughout northern Spain. They've both got little projects there and make wine in the area, and again have really helped to sort of bring the area on to the quality that is now being recognised. Another name that we mentioned last time, actually in Rioja, Telmo Rodriguez of Remoluri. He's another one of those winemakers who's moved into this area and is bringing his winemaking know-how, both from Bordeaux, where he worked as well, and from Rioja in to this area. The soils here are quite different from Rueda. There's a lot of red clay and, importantly, a lot of sandy soils. And the great thing about sandy soils is that the phylloxera, which devastated most of the vineyards across Europe, doesn't like sandy soil, so a lot of the vines here are actually on their original roots. The average vine age here of the older vineyards can be quite old, 80, 100, 120 years in some cases, which, as I mentioned before, with the climate here, with the low rainfall, this really benefits the quality of the wine because of the way the vine works when it gets to that. So the next one we've got here from Toro is the Flor de Virtus, which is a lovely example of the wines of this area. And you see immediately from the colour, it's a little bit darker than you might find in a Rioja. There's a little bit more depth of fruit. You notice that immediately on the nose. There's less overt vanilla than you would find in a Rioja, but it's definitely there. There's a great deal of fruit there, almost to the point of being jammy, because don't forget it is really hot, but it's just held together with that freshness of the acidity. There is a little bit of sort of damson, almost plum jam sort of flavour, but it's saved from being too jammy and cooked by that lovely acidity that holds it all together. This would be great with wild game such as venison or wild boar. It's a really good wine. Great deal of length. I'm still tasting it now. Lovely. It's quite high alcohol. It's 14.5%, but it wears it quite lightly. You're not getting that sort of burn that you can from some wines that have that alcohol but don't have the body to balance it out. Okay, so heading back east, back through Rueda, further up the Douro, we have the Ribera del Duero. And this region is more synonymous and almost on a par in terms of its recognition, particularly in the UK, as a quality region with Rioja. But as a quality wine region, the vine age here is generally quite young. There's some parcels of really old vines, which we'll talk about in a minute. but because the area has been exploited and expanded quite a bit, many of the vineyards are still relatively young. Historically, most of the wines from here were shipped in bulk, like a lot of the regions, particularly in southern Spain, to this day. But there was one standout producer that started in the mid-19th century, Vega Sicilia, and it was another of those outposts that was really started at the behest of the incoming winemakers from Bordeaux. And it was predominantly planted with Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, and a little bit of the local clone of Tempranillo here at Tintafina. And this wine, Vega Sicilia, which is still around today, it's still regarded as very much the top of the tree in the Ribera del Duero, was very age-worthy and as expensive as top Bordeaux. Even the King of Spain had to wait for his allocation back in the day, and it's still very much at the top of its game. In the 1970s, another producer started just down the road called Pescara, which is a name you might be familiar with, and they focused purely on the Tintafina grape, and they were the first to make people realise that this is a wine to be taken seriously in the same way Rioja is now taken seriously, and also makes very age-worthy wines in a similar style to Bordeaux, but with the local grape. Now, talking again about clones, the Tintafina clone here has much smaller berries, and what this means is you get a much higher proportion of skin to pulp, which means you get a lot more colour, depth of flavour, and everything else that goes with all those dark colouring matters in the skin, because don't forget the pulp is clear. All of the colour and depth of flavour in red wine comes from the skins, so you're going to get a wine from these grapes that has much more concentration. The main influence in this region in revitalising it after Vega Sicilia and Pescara was a Danish man called Peter Sissek. He worked a little bit in Bordeaux and then worked with Vega Sicilia to establish a winery called Hacienda Monastero. But while he was doing that, he actually discovered in the heartland of the Ribera del Duero in La Jorra little parcels of really old vine Tempranillo, Tintafina, which were planted in the late 20s. And he, from this, made his first vintage in, I think, 1996. And it absolutely wowed the critics. It was just an amazing wine, aged in French barriques, very much on the Rioja Bordeaux model. But the concentration of the wine really blew everyone away. Most importantly, Robert Parker, who gave it a really high score. The price rocketed, and it really put Ribera del Duero on the map in the mid-90s. And since then, there's been a lot of plantings in the area. Some less successful. A lot of producers, particularly those who've moved in from other regions, but I'm thinking here of Rioja, have used Rioja clones that they're familiar with, which aren't as suited to the area. But the example we've got here, although it's made by one of the interlopers, a Rioja producer, is they actually used the local clones to plant their vineyards. Their oldest vineyard's 40 years old. This is their entry-level wine, so the vines here are average age of about 20 years old. So you're starting to get a lot of that concentration I was talking about. Another thing worth mentioning is Ribera del Duero is actually the highest of the three regions. It's about 850 metres and above most of the vineyards. So you're getting an even more extreme example of that diurnal variation. In the middle of summer, it can be 35 degrees during the daytime and 12 degrees at night. And that drop in temperature, as I mentioned before, with both the other regions, really helps retain the freshness. It's a lot more subtle, this wine. I think they've used French oak here rather than American oak. I'm not getting any of that sort of coconut flavour. There is also a tendency to use more French oak in this region, but American oak's used as well. It's really down to the individual producer's choice. You might notice if you want to go back and taste the Toro again, this is a much more subtle wine. The Toro for me still has, it's that awful term we often use when we're talking about wine, rustic. It's really a sort of a catch-all term, meaning a wine that's authentic to its area but is a little rough around the edges. And although this is not a rough wine, it's certainly got a lot more. So I hope you've enjoyed this little sort of tour up and down the Duero. I think these are some really interesting wines, and I think you can see why these two areas in particular in the last 20 years, Toro and Ribera del Duero, have suddenly been put on the map, because they rival anything from Rioja or even Bordeaux in terms of quality. They're great wines, and we look forward to seeing you next week. We'll be heading across country towards Barcelona and Catalonia. Thank you.